Ningguang. Her viability as a DPS has often been questioned. It doesn't help that she is plagued by the maligned GEO element. Her place in many tier lists and in the meta is almost always down the bottom of the barrel. She can't hold a candle to the likes of Xiao, Raiden, Hu Tao, and to some extent even Diluc. Ningguang in many respects is a bad unit, and this is coming from an OG Ning main. She has shortcomings that are mainly limited by her own element. However, to this day, she still shows she has what it takes to carry teams in the abyss and beyond. So today I'll be taking you through Ningguang's best builds, teams, and ultimately her role in those teams in order to prove that Ningguang is the best GEO DPS. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening YouTube, it's your Slime King, the Jimmy Man, and welcome to another video. Okay, I lied. I initially wanted to make this a guide video to make Ningguang the best GEO DPS. However, that ended up being long and convoluted. Instead, I'll get right to the point. Today we will be discussing Ningguang's kit, team archetypes, and her best team, and her case for being the best GEO DPS in all of Teyvat. Ningguang is a strong GEO DPS at C6, and before that, she is subpar at best. Her kit is very cohesive, her skill and burst have huge modifiers and make up for her reactionless and lackluster element. Her normal attacks are where she truly differentiates herself from the pack. She is the only unit in the game that has access to a multi-hit on her first and only normal attack. We'll get more into that later. Majority of her damage comes from her burst and charge attacks, and thus it makes sense for her to be an on-field DPS. However, that is a misconception that especially highlights her weaknesses as a unit. As an on-field DPS, Ningguang suffers a lot from being so front-loaded in damage. The brunt of her damage comes from her burst into charge attack with C6. After that, her damage falls off a cliff, as number 1, her animations are clunky. When she twirls during an attack animation followed by a charge attack, it takes longer. When she swings her right hand to fire off a rock, it takes significantly longer. When she swings with her left hand to fire off a rock, it's a shorter animation. There is no way of controlling this and thus subject to RNG. And the only way I can think of why it is shorter is because when you fire off the left hand, the charge attack also fires off the left hand, so it's shorter. It's not a surprise that Ning feels so clunky to play because of this. And thus, the longer you spend time on Ning as the main DPS, the more her value drops off. Once you cast Burst and do N1C or N2C, you've essentially blown your load. And doing more Ning combos is not enough to sustain a team to clear Abyss comfortably. And yes, that's even with Memory of Dust or Skyward Atlas, and you are hitting upwards of 40k per charge attack. Not gonna matter. This is all due to the fact that her normal attacks don't do any damage, and the long wind-up to her charge attack just makes her subpar as the main on-field DPS. This brings us to her role in a team. Ningguang has been pigeonholed to an on-field hyper carry for some reason or another. I mean, okay, it's pretty easy to see, her charge attacks don't cost stamina when a normal attack hits, and her multipliers are high. However, as I've stated previously, the problem with this is that her damage output just isn't good enough to be put in that role, and thus, she will feel underwhelming, disappointing, and outright trashed if you make use of her like this. And to further understand this, let's take a look at a few teams. There are archetypes, 2 archetypes that make up a typical Ningguang team. Ning is an on-field DPS, and Ning as a burst DPS. Let's talk about the former first. A popular team that makes use of Ning as an on-field DPS is Shock Rock, aka Ningguang's only official Beidou. Obviously, you can replace Beidou with Xingqiu or Yelan, but the flaws of this archetype are the same regardless. The problem with Ning as an on-field driver in these teams is that she pales in comparison to the other alternatives. What makes Sucrose, Haizo, Kokomi, and Ayato so good is that they either proc EC, apply VV, or both, as they are driving while providing damage at the same time. In these Ning teams, Ning is merely providing damage, and its DPS that gradually decreases the more she is on field. Not to mention that her charge attacks are slow, making it worse to proc Beidou's burst. In a sense, Ning can be compared to Xiao. Xiao is a hyper carry that relies solely on his damage, and oftentimes Bennett and TTDS. However, the difference with Ning is that she doesn't have that sustained AoE, she doesn't have the base attack of a 5-star, and her animations are far more clunky than Xiao's. Not to mention that in most teams with Ning as on-field DPS, you have no other external buffs aside from Zhongli and Tenacity. and for a character with one of the lowest base attacks in the game, this hurts not only Ningguang, but also your Beidou or whoever you are trying to enable in these teams. And thus, the notion that Ningguang should be an on-field DPS should be eradicated from Teyvat's existence. The second archetype for Ning teams is running her as a burst DPS, and the best team that encapsulates this is Ningguang's only Raiden and Bennett. This team is essentially a quick swap team with Raiden to gap fill in between bursts. Bennett provides the much needed attack that Ningguang needs, and this team also hides the weaknesses of Ning's declining DPS the more time she spends on field, and this is the way she was meant to be played from the start. People hyperfixate on making every character an on-field DPS because most likely they are simps. However, it is obvious to see that Ning was never meant to be an on-field DPS for sustained periods of time. Just because her charge attack costs no stamina and her multipliers are high doesn't hold enough water to hold that argument. Her damage being so concentrated on her burst and 2 Jade Screams make it all the more emphasized that she was always meant to be a burst DPS. However, this is not her best team. I know, there are 2 archetypes for Ning DPS teams, and if the on-field DPS one is bad, then obviously the burst DPS is the right choice. However, there is actually a team that is a mix of both these archetypes. A team that makes use of all her strengths while hiding most of her weaknesses. Remember when I told you about her normal attack being multi-hit and it being unique? Well, this team perfectly abuses that uniqueness and allows Ning to fully realize the potential in her kit. The team consists of Ningguang, Zhongli, Yelan, and Yunjin. The whole crutch to this team is Yunjin and her burst is especially useful as it is a flat damage buff added onto your normal attacks. This is especially useful for low multiplier, multi-hit attacks. And Ningguang exactly has that, doesn't she? And the glue that further solidifies this synergy is Solar Pearl. Solar Pearl also gives a damage percent buff to your normal attacks upon skill or burst damaging an enemy. Yunjin and Solar Pearl allows you to buff Ning's normal attacks to exorbitant limits, so much that it becomes better to spam N1 than it is to ever do a charge attack. And Ning's normals are way faster, more consistent, and less clunky than doing N1 or N2C. To add to that, Yelan provides her damage buff while under her burst, and Ning is constantly proccing exquisite throws. This team is a perfect mix of enabling Ningguang to burst and becoming an on-field DPS at the same time without having to suffer from her clunkiness and long cast animations, as you are merely doing normal attacks. Her on-field time here doesn't even last more than 10 seconds before you'd redo the entire rotation all over again. And as such, this team is the perfect marriage of a burst DPS Ning and a main on-field DPS Ning. But the only catch is that you need an invested Yunjin and a Solar Pearl. When comparing her against other GEO DPSs, her worth is shown in spades. Against Ito, she shows her worth by having more team flexibility and not being forced to run mono GEO teams. I didn't talk about mono GEO Ning teams here, as obviously they are not as good. If on-field Ning is already subpar, what more for a team that was tailor-made to just buff her? Ito had severe restrictions on his teams and has moderate ER problems. Ito objectively does more damage, but the trade-off is that he only exists for mono GEO. Noelle requires a lot of ER to be able to burst off cooldown effectively, and her best GEO battery is frickin' GEO MC. She has more AoE, but again she requires teams to be built around her to succeed, whereas Ningguang can fit into most teams as a burst DPS. The best example is in Hu Tao double GEO teams, where you replace Albedo with Ning. Is it the best option? No. But is it a good one if you have a highly invested Ning? Yes. All this to say, what makes Ningguang the best GEO DPS is that she can excel even if you don't put all the right pieces around her. Of course, being GEO means being tethered to Zhongli, but that can be said about every other GEO in the game. It's her flexibility and her ability to work in so many teams that make her a much more worthwhile investment than any other GEO DPS in the game. And you can't deny Ningguang is beautiful. I mean, I hate to see her leave, but I love to watch her go. And that is why Ningguang is the best GEO DPS. Do you agree, or am I just straight up talking out of my Ning simp ass? Tell me down in the comments below, or better yet, come at me over at twitch.tv/thegmaman. where I stream Genshin almost every day. Come join the Slime Kingdom Discord where I feed you slime condensate every day. This is our parting. Farewell.